Hello, I am going to talk about the numbers 0 and 1. The difference between 0 and 1 is literally 1. If you do 1 minus 0, you get 1. But I think there's actually a huge difference in a lot of different ways. For example, right now we are living in the 21st century, even though the year is 2020. So you have 21st versus 20 because our modern way of measuring years, the first century in the thousands place was a 0. So you had year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And so you had a 0 starting that off, which is why we end up with a 21st century being in the year 2020. Another one is when you learn about linear functions, you learn y equals mx plus b, where b is the starting point or the y-intercept of your function. When you learn about sequences and you learn about an arithmetic sequence, which is really a linear situation, you don't start with 0. You start with the first term. So you end up with a way weirder equation. A lot of times it's written as an plus 1 equals d, and then in parentheses n minus 1, and then plus a1. That a1 at the end represents your starting point, but instead of starting with the 0th term, we start with the first term. So with linear, you get a much nicer looking equation, y equals mx plus b, because we start with the 0, but in sequences, we get a way funkier equation because we start with the first term instead of the 0th term. Another example is when you're counting the number of items. If you're trying to count how many numbers there are from 1 to 10 or from 0 to 10, a lot of times students get a little caught up because they end up counting the number of steps in between items instead of counting the number of items. So for example, if we make a list of the numbers 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, so 10 through 20, including 10 and 20, a lot of people would say, oh, that's 10 items. Well, it's not. And they're like, no, dude, 20 minus 10 is 10. And you're like, yes, but that's the number of steps. You have to add one more for the number of numbers. So another place where starting with the first item instead of starting with the 0th item causes a problem. My son, when they started counting in school, a lot of times they would actually start by saying 0, which I thought was pretty cool. So finally, this idea of 0. 0 was something that actually there was a time in history that 0 was considered heretical or against the law. You could not talk about 0, you couldn't write about 0, you couldn't study the idea of 0. It had to do with a lot of religious beliefs. So it's kind of a crazy thing to think that the number 0 was something that could get you in jail or even killed, hung, or something like that. And finally, the numbers 0 and 1, why are they so cool? So in mathematics, it turns out that 0 and 1 are both identities. An identity is something that if you do that thing to an object, it doesn't change the object. So 0 is the identity of addition. Any number plus 0 gives you the number you started with. And 1 is the identity of multiplication. Anything multiplied by 1 stays as the number you started with. So they are identities, which is a very important thing in studying objects and operations between objects. More on that in a later video. One challenge for you. Think about something that I didn't talk about where the difference between 0 and 1 is important or causes problems. If you think of something like that, please put it down in the comments.